Hello, gathering. Welcome to worship. My name is Evie Martin. I am our Clayton site pastor, but today I am here with all of you. It is great to worship together with you. I miss you. I've enjoyed talking to a lot of you on the phone and on the computer this week. I hope that we get to continue to do that, but I hope that you are staying healthy and being careful and being caring for one another in this season. It's really difficult not to get to see your faces right now, not to know what expressions you have on your face, or if you're listening or dozing off or laughing at my witty jokes. I'm just going to assume it's yes on the last one, and I'll leave a long pause after each one, just, not to make it awkward or anything. But all of that to say, as strange as all of this is, it still feels really good to know that we are in this weekly rhythm of worship together and that we are doing this as a community of faith. We are continuing in our Lenten sermon series that's helping us to mark time on our journey toward Easter. We've called this series Dying to Live, and we're asking the question, why the cross matters. As the central and most recognizable symbol of our faith, the cross has taken on a lot of meaning through the ages. And like any good symbol, it doesn't just mean one thing. Instead, we have compared it to a prism. A prism reflects light 100 different ways depending on where you're standing. There's no single point of light to see, but always beauty bouncing off of every wall. The cross gives us a similar effect. Over the course of a couple thousand years, theologians, scholars, churchgoers, Jesus followers have chased after these reflections, trying to make sense out of an act, Christ's crucifixion, that can never fully be understood. And yet, then and now and every time in between, we find glimpses of its beauty bouncing off every wall. Last week, Matt talked about one particular perspective adopted early on in Christianity. He talked about the understanding of the cross as redemption. This is the idea that we find our strength and our salvation because Jesus has bought us back, freed us from that which holds power over us, namely sin and death. But today we're going to look at it from a slightly different angle. But rather than go all the way back to first century Jerusalem to explain it, I want to start instead with the American Civil War. During those years, young men and families lived with the uncertainty of conscription or being drafted, just like some generations of you who have served our country remember. But for some families, maybe families with only one son, or a son who was needed for working the fields or the family business, or for families who were quite wealthy, there was a way to bypass going to war. You could pay someone else to go in your place. First for $100 and then later for $300, which was a year's wages, you could pay a willing volunteer to go fight and, of course, possibly die, so you wouldn't have to. And a lot of people did this, of course, which ultimately led to countless stories and haunting realities of men later in their post-war lives going to visit grave sites of soldiers they had never met who had died so they could live. The substitutes who had gone in their place. That word, that idea is the lens through which we'll look at the cross today, the lens of substitution. Substitution is the dominant Western view of the crucifixion, and it has been for easily 500 years. So in the last half a millennium, if you grew up in North America or Europe and someone told you the story of the cross, this is likely the version that you heard. It's what preachers preached. It's what theologians wrote about. It's what our songs and our hymns lock into our hearts and our minds and our memories, even still today. Jesus took my place. I was the one who should have died. Jesus' life was substitute for my own. Which immediately then begs the question that's at the heart of our series, why? Why would Jesus take my place? Why was it that he had to? It takes a little more history to unpack this, so travel with me for a moment. About 1,000 years back this time, Saint Anselm of Canterbury was the theologian to really develop the framework and the first metaphors around this idea of substitution. He lived in medieval Europe, which of course was structured into categories of primarily landowners and peasants. It was a feudal system at the time. And in his work of trying to unravel the mysteries of all that happened at the cross, he did what most of us do. And he used his understanding of the world in which he lived to try to grasp an understanding of God. So in his world, peasants served landowners. They lived according to the rules set by the master. There was no national law or a federal government to set the law for the land. Each master had to uphold his own system of justice. The point being that if a peasant then should disobey the master, step out of line, break a rule, the master had to exact a punishment. The consequence must be doled out in order to uphold this system of justice. Any form of leniency undermined the master's own authority, his own order, and it would make it seem as if disobedience wasn't really that big of a deal. So the whole justice system of that particular master, that landowner, would quickly fall apart. Basically, every misdeed, every disobedience demanded really, a punishment. This understanding of his world then, Anselm transferred onto a picture of our human relationships with God. To lay it out, every human act of disobedience or misstep from God's law requires a response from God. And if God's justice system is to remain intact and not be undermined, then God must exact a punishment. The crime demands a punishment. Someone must take it on so that God's justice is satisfied. And since humans have a remarkable tendency for screwing things up, well, there is lots of justice to satisfy. Enter Jesus. If all of our mistakes, missteps, disobedience, sin demand a consequence, it cannot go unanswered or overlooked. We really should be paying the price. The punishment is ours. But in comes the substitute. Jesus steps in and takes our place, takes the punishment that was meant for us. That's the gist of this theory surrounding the cross. We refer to it as substitution, but it's also interlaced with a theory of satisfaction. You heard me use that word a couple times already, and you can see how the two are so closely connected. Over time, as Western civilization progressed and formalized, you might recognize how even our justice systems today are built on this same premise that crime demands punishment. Much of how our society works today revolves around this principle of retributive justice. So it's no wonder then that we now easily latch onto this understanding of what happened for us when Jesus was crucified on the cross. He took the punishment that was meant for us. We are saved from it. He satisfied what God's justice demanded. He was substitute for us. Now, it's not as if this notion just evolved 1,000 years later after Jesus' crucifixion. There is early imagery for it in the New Testament. The writer of Hebrews explains this way in Hebrews chapter 9. People are destined to die once and then face judgment. In the same way, Christ was also offered once to take on himself the sins of many people. And in 1 Peter we read, he carried in his own body on the cross the sins we committed. He did this so that we might live in righteousness, having nothing to do with sin. By his wounds you were healed. And again, in 2 Corinthians, God caused the one who didn't know sin to be sin for our sake, so that through him we could become the righteousness of God. Each of these verses gives the very real sense that the judgment was intended for us. The punishment was due to us. The sins committed were ours, and yet, since Jesus had no sins of his own to account for, he was able to take all of ours on himself, in his own body, by his own death. His substitution satisfied what we should have endured. Growing up in the church, I remember as a teenager, that's really when your cognitive development starts to first allow you to grasp some of these abstract ideas, but I remember hearing this message of the cross, and it gave me a lot of feelings. I would hear youth pastors teach about how my mistakes and my sin in my heart were the very reasons that Jesus hung dying on that cross, and I would feel so much guilt and shame. I would learn in Wednesday night Bible study that Jesus loved me enough to take my place and endure so much pain so that I wouldn't have to, and I felt responsible. I would listen to summer youth camp speakers the last night of the week. You know, if you went to church camp, the last night was always the special worship service where everyone's supposed to come down for the altar call at the end, and the speaker would give these convicting, heartfelt messages about Jesus taking my punishment for some teenage sin or crime that, quite frankly, I wasn't sure deserved crucifixion, but there it was, and that he was thinking specifically of me as he hung there dying on the cross, and I would feel special and loved, and I would feel gratitude, and I would feel relief that it wasn't me with the nails in my hands and my feet, and I would cry, and I would walk down that aisle for the altar call, and I would commit my life to Jesus again every year. Much like the men who didn't fight in the Civil War, I suspect, there is no absence of feeling when you encounter the one who stepped in and died in your place. It's humbling. It evokes gratitude. It convicts. And this is much of what a satisfaction or substitution view of the cross invites us to feel. It pulls us into self-honesty, a reckoning with what is in our hearts that we cannot make right on our own, an accounting of our actions before God which demand consequences that we have not had to pay. And yet, as I grew into and then out of my adolescence, I found something wanting in this particular view of the cross. It has some distinct problems, and when it becomes the only view of the cross that we are taught, it dangerously limits what our hearts and minds can receive from what happened there. The more we pull at these threads of substitution and satisfaction, the more we begin to find some pesky knots in the strand. To be frank, it's a view that seems very cold and mechanical. There's an equation for how the wrongs of the world should be righted. It suggests that forgiveness is like math. It's only granted if the equation for wrongs committed and price paid adds up. This also has the result of placing all of our salvation on Jesus' death. If the act of death is what zeroed out the equation, then what does that say about Jesus' life and his ministry and his teaching, not to mention his resurrection? Easter becomes sort of an appendix to the drama of salvation rather than the center point of our hope. Another problem that this satisfaction model presents is the endorsement of a gruesomely violent act. Seeing the crucifixion as something that God requires makes God out to be a bloodthirsty judge exacting his justice through violence. Linking sanctioned violence to our understanding of our own salvation is deeply troubling. It is not good news to victims of violence, and it's frightening and harmful in the hands of perpetrators of violence today. The cross was a violent act. There's no hiding that. But was it one that was demanded and validated by God? Or was it one that was suffered and endured by God to demonstrate to us the depths of love and mercy? And perhaps the biggest problem with this lens on the cross is that the notion of Jesus satisfying God's justice on our behalf and taking the punishment that we should have binds together punishment and forgiveness. The two become inextricably linked. By this logic, we are only forgiven because the price was paid, the punishment was fulfilled. And the problem with tying punishment and forgiveness together is that that connection doesn't ring true throughout the rest of the gospel, nor in our own lived experience of giving and receiving forgiveness. It makes God an angry God, and our salvation only comes when his wrath has been satisfied. I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to throughout my years as a pastor whose primary sense around God is fear. Fear because God is angry. Fear because God is judge. Fear because they will always disappoint God and deserve punishment. And maybe you are one who relates to that. I think that fear comes primarily because of how we've been taught to understand what Jesus' death meant for us, that it was our punishment, the one we deserved. But I'm not sure it's entirely right. And I don't believe it's consistent with the God that we see throughout Scripture and in the person of Jesus Christ. It leaves us floundering in this fog of fear, and it clouds or even obscures our notion of grace. What is grace if the sentence has been carried out? I think it's time to let go of some of these harmful narratives that substitution and satisfaction theories have written into our understanding of God. But is there something left that we might reclaim? Is there an understanding of satisfaction that goes beyond this cosmic retributive justice system? I think the answer is yes. All of what we have said so far paints a picture of Jesus' saving act at the cross as a transaction. If we think of sin as our misdeeds, then satisfaction must be the punishment to cancel out the transaction. But the entire rest of our story of God and humanity points to something else. God's not interested in transactional relationships. Jesus makes that clear over and over again when he's correcting the Pharisees who are so obsessed with keeping the letter of every law. God instead is forever interested in transformation. God is interested in relationships that are broken being made right. God is interested in bodies that are sick being restored. God is interested in people trapped in bondage and oppression being set free. These are not transactions, they are transformation. Why wouldn't the cross then be the epicenter for that message, for that intention of God for us? What if the sin that the cross takes care of isn't an account of every misstep and wrong action that has to be balanced out with a price, but is actually much bigger than that? What if sin is everything in our condition that separates us from God? And what satisfies God is not a punishment, but a reconciliation that brings us back together. What if Jesus' death on the cross satisfies the love of God, not the wrath of God? God's self-determination from the very beginning is to be related to us. God created us, knows us, and loves us, and throughout the entire Bible, God is determined also to be known by us. And yet, we wander off, we turn away, we get confused by all that comes at us in life. We make poor choices. We become separated. We sometimes even get lost to the point that in the Bible we're often compared to sheep. Through the prophet Ezekiel, God describes our human predicament this way. As a shepherd seeks out the flock, when some in the flock have been scattered, so I will seek out my flock. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered during the time of clouds and thick darkness. Jesus later quotes that very passage when he's talking to his disciples, telling them why he has come in the first place. In the Gospel of Luke, he says, "The human one," that's him, Jesus, "the human one came to seek and save the lost." Jesus' entry into our world, his life from its very first moments, his teaching and healing and challenging and guiding, all of it was God seeking us out, rescuing us from the places where we have been scattered and lost. All of it satisfied God's unending and relentless love for us. His crucifixion was the pinnacle moment that showed not the height of God's anger, but rather the depths of God's love. The unfathomable lengths that God would go to just to be in relationship with us. God doesn't stay out of or above or immune to our pain and suffering. God doesn't will it upon us. Instead, God enters right into the worst of it. The unjust accusations, the wrongful sentencing, the relentless torture, the ridicule, the agonizing death, the darkness of a tomb. Because these are the things that humans fear. They're the things that humans who have lost their way do to one another. They are the things that we live day in and day out. They are the things that make us wonder if we are alone. And Jesus steps in and says, never. Crucifixion takes into Jesus' body not some future punishment that we now get to avoid, but the present suffering that we already endure. The violence that fills our cities and our rhetoric and sometimes even our homes. The actions and the words that have harmed us and that we use to harm others, the oppression of loneliness and abandonment, anxiety and isolation, the sickness and the fear that plagues us in every age, even now, the shadow of death that marks each of our lives. He takes the suffering of our lives into his own. He wraps our death inside of his, and he satisfies the divine desire from the beginning of time to be reconciled in love with humanity. To say to us, I know what you know. I feel what you feel. I carry these burdens that you carry. Let me take them up with you. Paul describes it this way in Galatians chapter 2. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in my body, I live by faith. Indeed, by the faithfulness of God's Son who loved me and gave himself for me. Our lives, our bodies, our deaths are taken up in Jesus at the cross so that his life is now wrapped up in ours. In the year 1513, there was an artist named Matthias Grunewald. He was commissioned by the monks of St. Anthony to paint a new altarpiece for a chapel at a hospital in a small town in Germany. This was an era, as you might know, where plagues were ravaging the population of Europe year after year. They were fighting these plagues, and the monks in this hospital were treating many of the poorest victims of the plagues. It was the final stop for many before they died. Fear and despair, suffering and sickness were rampant then, feelings that many of us are reckoning with now in a health climate that we never saw coming. But the painting that Grunewald completed for this hospital turned out to be shocking for many, appalling even for others. It was grotesque for its time. The agony in it was more graphic than any other Renaissance artists were willing to portray. Jesus' body is stretched. His hands are tense and gnarled. The sky is dark and ominous. But the most distinct feature of this crucifixion painting, and perhaps the most off-putting to the healthy people who saw it, were the sores and the lacerations that Grunewald painted on Jesus' body. They were the same types of sores that the dying patients who were worshiping in that chapel would have had on their own diseased and failing bodies. What the artist gave to those patients was a vision of the Christ who knew their infirmities, who took their pain into his own body, who was not a stranger to their suffering, but took it on and transformed it. He painted what a modern theologian would later describe as the suffering of love, which is not afraid of what is sick and ugly, but accepts it and takes it to itself in order to heal it. The cross isn't some quantifiable, understandable, well-ordered mathematical transaction that we can fully grasp or explain. Even if we want it to be, it simply isn't. Instead, it's mysterious. It's nonsensical. It's confusing and confounding because it is love. It is the greatest love. It's the love that steps into the place of another so they know that they are found, rescued, no longer lost and alone. No one has greater love than to give up one's life for one's friends. These were Jesus' words to his disciples, some of his very last, around a table the night before he would go to his death. There was no talk of punishment, no indication that he was paying a price that they owed, no chastisement that God was angry about their sin. There was only talk of love. He was telling them how much he loved them. And in the same breath, he was telling them to love in the same way. This is my commandment, he said to them. Love each other just as I have loved you. No one has greater love than to give up one's life for one's friends. The cross is our sign and our promise that God is satisfied with love. That love is not easy. It comes with the greatest of costs. It is laden with suffering and pain, and it will walk all the way through death's door to rescue you, but not to spoil the Easter surprise. It will not stay there. There is no shortage of sin in our lives and in our world. We are pulled away. We are separated from God in all kinds of ways. Some of it is our own doing. Some of it is built into the systems and the powers of the world around us. But wherever and however you find that you are losing your way or wandering far from God or separated by a chasm that you don't feel you can cross, this cross is here for you today. It is not the emblem of how far away you are from God. It is the promise of how close God is to you. Will you pray with me? In the flesh and frailty of our humanity, Lord, you have come to us. When we wander off and lose our way, Lord, you come after us. When our suffering seems too great to bear, Lord, you come to bear it in our place. We adore you, Lord Jesus Christ, and we bless you. For by your holy cross, you have redeemed the world. Amen.